feel free to share your thoughts and ask the hard questions if that's what you want to ask. This is a space for you to be able to do that. At the end, we'll put a link in the chat also for an evaluation. I hope you'll please fill that out. It's important to us. It helps us understand what works, what could use improving, and what else you'd like to hear from us. So with that, I'll hand it over to today's moderator, Juliet Homer.
Great, thank you very much, Jeff. Hi, everyone. I'm Juliet Homer from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and I'm really pleased to be moderating this session today. We have 3 excellent presentations on advancing equity considerations in distribution system planning. The webinar is 90 minutes and we'll have time for Q&A. So please engage with us and add your questions to the chat or raise your hand and ask questions when we get to that point. So first we'll be hearing from Jen Yoshimura, also from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, or PNNL, and she'll provide us her perspective on key issues for commissions to consider relative to equity and distribution system plans. Then we'll hear from staff at 2 public utility commissions. We'll hear from Sarah Hall and Ezell Watson from the Oregon PUC, and then we'll hear from Tera Dornfeld and Hannah Terwilliger from the Minnesota PUC. And I'll moderate Q&A and discussion after Jen's presentation, and then after the 2 presentations from our PUCs. As Jeff said, we're recording the webinar. Only this first part that will be presented by Jen will be available publicly, and the rest will just be available to PUC's staff. As I said, please use the chat box as we go along for questions. We'll also have a link to the presentations in the chat. And then we'll have the link to the ever important survey at the end, also in the chat. All right, so with that, Jen, if you want to start pulling up your slides, I'll do an intro here for Jen Yoshimura. So Jen is an energy justice and equity leader and project manager at PNNL. She combines 20 years of industry knowledge and experience conducting software quality assurance with the Department of Defense, building engineering design in the Pacific Northwest, renewable energy planning at Hawaiian Electric Company, energy efficiency and conservation at Puget Sound Energy, and management of Puget Sound's energy transmission engineering department. She also led HDR's Washington Power Delivery Substation Transmission and Distribution Engineering teams, where she was responsible for strategic business development and growth, client services, and employee development and performance. Jen is also a 2018 graduate and 2019 coach of Leadership Tomorrow, a civic leadership program in Puget Sound region. And while at HDR, she was one of the 3 leaders that created the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force for HDR's Washington office. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jen.
Awesome. Thank you for the introductions, Juliet, and appreciate the opportunity to share more about energy equity and distribution system planning at today's peer sharing webinar. Hopefully you folks can see my screen okay. And yeah, so as Juliet mentioned, I'm an advisor at Pacific Northwest National Lab. And I'll be going over a high-level overview, of grid planning objectives, the energy justice movement, and an overview of the justice tenets, highlighting work from one of our GMLC equity database projects between PNNL and LBNL, as well as E9 Insights. And then walk through, opportunities as well as things to consider in, prioritization from a planning perspective, whether states, PUCs, or utilities, in conjunction with communities' goals and needs and example attributes of a healthy community. Looking through the process flow of a distribution system planning process and how equity can be incorporated through that. Walk through some examples from LBNL and Portland General Electric, as well as AEEE, and then wrap up with considerations and things to think about as you're moving forward in the work that you folks are all leading. So with that, let's see if we can advance slides. So Emerging objectives, they may not be so much emerging anymore, but thinking traditionally, electric grid planning strives to maintain safe, reliable, efficient, and affordable service, both for existing customers as well as future customers. As we see policies and social preferences shift, as well as events, whether it is cybersecurity events or natural events such as wildfires, hurricanes, snow and ice, system planners need to consider these new emerging objectives as part of their planning process, focusing around decarbonization, resilience that can be grid and community resilience, as well as energy equity and justice. Relative to the traditional objectives, where we look at reliability, whether it's SAIDI, safety, CAIDI at a system level, and costs, these other objectives, especially equity, are not necessarily well integrated within the planning paradigms. So stepping back a little bit for folks around, where we're at and where we've come, acknowledging that there's, previous movements from the climate justice movement in the 90s and 2000s, and prior to that, the environmental justice movement in the 70s and 80s, recognizing that many Black, Brown, Indigenous, tribal leaders, even prior to the 70s, we're initiating and promoting a lot more focus around social and racial justice tied to environment. So I put links in the slides. I believe these slides will be available for attendees. So would encourage you folks to check out links when you have time, and other projects that I'll be highlighting as well throughout today's presentation. I was told that many of you are aware of the energy justice tenets, but for some that aren't aware and or just good grounding for today's presentation, a reminder around these 4 tenets that we look at as we're incorporating energy equity and energy justice in our work. It's recognition, procedural, distributive, and restorative justice. Oftentimes we see leaders and organizations and agencies jump straight to procedural and distributive justice without recognizing communities who have been misrecognized or not recognized. And that first recognition justice is very important and critical, because if we don't recognize communities, especially those not recognized historically or misrecognized, we'll continue to create disparities and perpetuate those disparities for those communities and individuals. On the right-hand side of the screen are just examples around, dimensions and how we look at measuring energy equity and justice, whether it's energy burden, insecurity, energy poverty, and vulnerability. Looking at one of our projects where we partnered, PNL partnered with LBNL and E9 Insights through GMLC, Grid Modernization Lab Consortium. There was an equity database looking at across the country around the justice tenets and how states were looking at incorporating energy equity and regulation and legislation at a state level. Highly recommend folks to check out the links. This one slide does not do the team's justice with the amount of effort and work and insights that they've developed on this project. But this slide is really intended to kind of pull back at a high level and assess where states are looking at and what action items were taken from January 2020 to July 2022. And the next few slides are going to weave in, the energy equity actions that we see and how that can translate down to the work that you folks are leading, partnerships with utilities, and then engagement with communities. We see this oftentimes on the right-hand side of the screen, objectives and priorities within a planning process, and also just performance process for state and utilities, whether it's reliability through system level metrics, SAIDI, safety, CAIDI, understanding where asset management and safety investments will be made, either short, mid, or long-term investments, capital infrastructure projects, where decarbonization and energy efficiency and conservation programs are, as well as rates and potentially energy burden, and where new products and services can be looked at for customers. Not all of what's on the right-hand side may be translatable to the left-hand side of the screen, which is just examples of what a healthy community may be looking at. And again, communities are not monoliths, but you can see energy is one component that can intersect a healthy community or a healthy household, and can influence and or impact education, food security, health and wellness, transportation, water, and housing. And so, as we look at the intersection of the energy industry, how does that correlate to some of the community, not just needs, but goals that they're striving to? And so looking not only at gaps, but where there's opportunity to bridge, where planning aspects and infrastructure investments are made that can support as well as needs. So with that, some of you may have recognized this process flow from other programs or projects. This is a process flow from one of our Department of Energy, Office of Electricity projects, focused mainly on integrated distribution system planning. Walking through the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see that I put in text and overlaid it, trying to create a tangent through the recognition, procedural, distributive, and restorative justice tenets, as well as examples of dimensions of energy equity. So for example, on the planning objectives and criteria, we can think about recognition justice as well as procedural justice, not just stakeholders that get included in the creation of these objectives and criteria, but where can communities, especially those not recognized, be included? And this is really important on iterative feedback and processes, not having a one and done in an extractive process or relationship built, but really the co-creation of policies and outcomes and objectives. Procedural justice, looks at also the processes and policy and requirements through supply chain and procurement, as well as workforce development. As we move through the IDSP process in the midsection on the upper part, we can think about grid and community resiliency, as well as energy burden. Through weather and climate forecasts, there's a lot of emphasis and focus on grid hardening and infrastructure investments. How does that couple also with some of the community resiliency goals and partnerships, and then the additional costs that could be incurred and translated through an energy burden lens. As we move through the bottom part of that orange section, we can think of distributive justice around the holistic benefits, and through the assessment and analysis, whether it's environment, the system itself, metrics, and community, as near, mid, and long-term investments are being looked at through planning. And as we move through the right-hand side of the process flow, thinking about the sourcing of distributed energy resources and microgrids being provided, thinking about energy democracy and a restorative justice component, what could co-ownership look like for communities in conjunction with utilities and or different agencies and stakeholders, as well as different pricing structures that can benefit communities and create intra and intergenerational wealth and well-being. On the bottom right-hand side, where the blue boxes are, I've put energy and community security, whether that's a grid hardening or modernization, new products and services that are being incorporated within these annual and mid and long-term plans, as well as community resiliency and how that translates to the previous slide around food and transportation and education as energy intersects a healthy household and well-being for that community. This slide is just a high-level overview, again, kind of relating energy metrics and equity metrics to the justice tenets. There's procedural and recognition that I mentioned earlier, and thinking about not just the representation or having a seat at the table, but the inclusivity of individuals and the decision-making process that those people can have, and the fairness in those decision-making processes, the transparency and planning as well from decisions that are made. In the middle column, we look at distributive justice. That could either be affordability and availability and also accessibility. Thinking about electric costs and energy costs, what that burden looks like, an affordability gap, the quality of electricity and energy to homes. Also programs that are available. I mentioned energy efficiency and conservation, and I'll get to that in a few slides later. And then we also look at a social burden as well. And then restorative, I mentioned inter and intra-generational, sustainability and responsibility that can intersect economic aspects, whether it's workforce and job training, co-ownership and government, governance of systems, environment, and then social aspects as well. I took this slide and literally copied it from LB&L in their work from an example from Portland General Electric, because I think it really highlights the really the commitment needed from all parties, communities, utilities, federal, state, local agencies, in terms of how we're moving forward and how we want to have equity included within distribution system planning, but really the process as a whole. The system wasn't built with equity, yet we're trying to get to equitable outcomes. And so it's going to take a long-term commitment and relationship and trust building. From Portland General Electric, there's the approach from community engagement through the lens of environmental justice. There's a lot of listening and communicating. Data is highly desired by everyone. And at the same time, we see, at least within the work that I manage and lead, also this understanding of sensitivity of data and how data will be used. And so making sure that that information is transparent to communities. Budget is another one, as well as timing and relevancy. Participation. I know that utilities and PUCs, states and multiple agencies are wanting proactive participation from communities for adoption, as well as implementation of clean energy policy. And I would add to this second bullet, participation also needs to have education for the public and communities to be proactive in that participation. And then the financial support on the third bullet for community-based organizations in order for participation. And then, looking at how distribution and distributive justice is being looked at through program design and pricing. Utilities and communities and PUCs and states, we can't do it individually. To get to the outcomes that we want, it will require partnerships. And so what I really valued from this example is, this idea to partner with local cities and counties in moving forward and in advancing climate and sustainability action. Thinking about restorative justice and distributive justice and what that partnership looks like with other agencies and communities. Everyone has a different, I would say, lived experiences and is learning through and has their own unique individual journey, equity and justice journey. We're not going to get it right the first time. We make mistakes and we make missteps. And so this last bullet, I acknowledge, we need to learn together, seek feedback, and try again. The one thing I would add to this bullet is making sure that as we're learning together, that we're not repeating the same missteps or the same mistakes, especially for communities that have historical harm and burdens. And so not perpetuating the same harms and the same mistakes. So where can we incorporate lessons learned from previous missteps, learn together, as well as translate those lessons learned to other situations that can build further trust and relationships moving forward. The left-hand side of the screen is an image from AEEE and some of the work that they've been leading. And there's a lot of synergies with what I've shared so far on today's presentation. I really value, the connection back to the justice tenets, the considerations around intergenerational impacts, and really highlighting, that there are historical, cultural, institutional dynamics. States, PUCs, utilities, communities, we're not monoliths. There's unique history and context, and it's really important to understand that as you're incorporating equity throughout the planning process. On the right-hand side of the screen are other factors or considerations, I would say, as we look toward achieving equitable outcomes. Energy efficiency programs, oftentimes those programs are only accessible to individuals and households that are served by a utility and has energy service, recognizing that there are many homes and families throughout the country that don't have any infrastructure and therefore no energy service to their home, which makes them ineligible to participate in these programs, where most often they're probably needing those energy efficiency appliances and access to rebates and programs and opportunities. So something to consider for future work. And then energy efficiency, thinking about portfolio, program, and measures. What disparities are hidden through portfolio metrics versus program and measures? And so what are the outcomes and consequences through the different ways of measuring those programs? The next two items, education and partnerships, I believe are linked. In order to get people to participate, we want them to be educated. And some of that may require cultivating non-traditional partnerships to increase engagement, increase awareness, and education to further impact. And last but not least is the methodologies and approaches. Checking assumptions when we're looking at methods or programs or processes. What are the metrics and measurements that we're creating? And it's okay to have different measurements and metrics in the community. There will be synergies, but there may be differences in what communities would like to measure versus what the industry and or at a state level or utility level is looking at. And last but not least, data is one component, and tying back to, AEEE's resources and work is really educating ourselves on the historical systems and policies that have created inequities, and ensuring that we're being sensitive as we're reaching out and building those relationships, and ensuring that we're not perpetuating them moving forward in the work that we're doing. And last but not least, I think it's important to meet states where they're at. States, PUCs, utilities, communities, we're all in a different journey. We've had different starting points. We have different lived experiences. But things to remember to leave you with, the system wasn't built with equity, yet we're trying to get to equitable outcomes. There's this sense of urgency to quicken the pace of how we roll things out. And so it's okay to pause and be intentional and reflect and educate yourself as you move forward in the work that you're leading. Relationship focus is really important, ensuring that it's not transactional, especially when we're bringing other people along that have not been included in the process, and we want to ensure that they maintain that engagement and sustain that engagement. And last but not least, in order to get to the equitable outcomes that we're trying to achieve, it requires action. I found this resource and put the link in the bottom and pulled the top two bullets out of, everyone needs to understand their personal journey, and we all need to challenge our biases and understand our biases. And Juliet has heard me say this a lot, as well as our P&L team, but in order to get to equity, we all need to understand the positions of power and privilege that we hold, both in our personal lives and in our professional settings, and spend it wisely. So with that, I appreciate the time and the opportunity to share more about energy equity and how that can be incorporated within the distribution system planning process. So thanks for your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen. Really appreciate that. Right on time. I love that. Yeah, so we've got a few minutes here and would love to, kind of be casual about this. We don't have any questions specifically in the chat, but does anyone have any questions or comments based on that presentation? I've got a few questions myself, but would love to hear from our neighbor participants, our PUCs. Anyone? Okay, well, I'll ask a question, but feel free to add something into the chat, folks, or raise your hand if you've got a question. So Jen, you talked about the kind of partnerships, non-traditional partnerships being important. And if a PUC is looking to want to bring more voices into a proceeding, a distribution system planning proceeding, I think a lot of times PUCs have a certain number of folks who participate in each docket, right? What do you think are some suggestions for how to broaden the scope or the participation? How to bring in some of those non-traditional partnerships? Do you have any suggestions for where to begin in that?
Yeah, I think of at least from working with our DOE partners, right, and the amount of different programs from a community perspective that we partner with other labs on through technical assistance. And there's, I would say, a lot of requests from communities of understanding what they're thinking, and they have some unique, I would say, approaches or thoughts. And so, leveraging where we have pathways that have been already created, and inviting them to this process, right? Instead of siloing, I think, different pathways, seeing where there's integration and intersection between other programs that communities are already participating in.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is also, an opportunity. We talk a lot about workforce through universities and partnerships with vocational schools, with some of the other work that I manage. And I think that's like another opportunity of, bringing young professionals and those still within the school system into understanding what that process looks like and what, where can they participate as they mature in their careers and have more voice in the jobs that they have, and also just as public participation. So.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. We got a nice comment from Roseanne. Thanks for that. No questions, but agree with everything you presented, especially the care and consideration necessary for actualizing energy equity. Yeah, another question is, you talked about the importance of not being kind of transactional, that having relationship be the focus and not kind of transactions. Can you talk a little bit more about that, what that might look like in the context of utilities and like PUCs engaging with parties? What's transactional versus kind of relationship based?
Yeah, sure. I think there's transactions, at least working for utilities, where communities are engaged really for the benefit of the utility for infrastructure, and for either new or maintaining existing systems. But really, there's not necessarily intentionality to maintain that engagement once the community piece or that box is checked. And so I think there are opportunities to create space for communities to build relationships with their utility that's just beyond trying to create or maintain existing or new infrastructure within a community. And that's where that perspective is more extractive, and communities really only have that experience when something is needed from them, and it's transactional. So there's definitely, I think, ways where we can improve that process. And so it's not just when you have an entity that needs something.
Got it. Okay, thank you. That's helpful. We've got a question here from Taru. Can you please address how data can be used to achieve equity?
Yeah, so I think it's important to, data, like anything, there's benefits and then there's consequences. Data, there are aspects of types of data and how it can be used. And I would say, there's sensitivities around customer data, as well as community data. And as we're trying to look at, even energy burden, for example, the aspects of energy burden is understanding also the household income from a household, and utilities may not have that information. And so as we're looking at addressing equity, and more specifically around energy equity, there is potential partnerships that are needed across different industries. Even thinking of, elderly individuals or individuals that have healthcare equipment at home, such as like oxygen tanks or medical equipment that rely on energy. And so, what does the impact of when they don't have energy, what does the impact to their household or that individual look like from a health and wellness perspective? Or when you have communities that don't have any energy infrastructure, what does the length of time and cost of gas to pick up ice, and how much ice do they need to refill their ice chests to refrigerate their, not refrigerate, but to essentially cool their prescription drugs? So that's where types of data can be used to achieve equity and help us inform where we can move forward to get to equity. And at the same time, there are communities who I would say through recognition and again, historical harms, where data has been used against them. And so it's really, I think, important to get to know communities first, understanding relationships, build the trust, and then understanding how data can be used in co-benefits for both community and then what we're trying to achieve, and being respectful of what that sensitivity is. I hope I answered that question around data and how it can be used to achieve equity.
Yeah, I think you did, Jen. Okay, yeah, look, great. Tara says yes, thank you. All right, we'll have one other question, then we get to go on to the next presenters, but maybe you can address some follow-up questions that are arising in the chat after that, Jen. But one last question for you here. Can you talk a little bit more about suggestions or best practices for conducting stakeholder engagement? Just hosting a public meeting at the PUC or PSC after traditional work hours might not be enough. And that's kind of a big question, but love to hear your initial thoughts on that.
Yeah, I've heard many examples like this, and this desire from PUCs and PSCs to try to understand their communities more. And this is where I think there's opportunities for the educational piece and understanding access to information, whether it's language or phone, visual. There are meetings after traditional work hours, and then also thinking about transportation as well. So there are, what comes to mind, I would say, is a whole host of diverse pathways or doors for communities to engage with you folks. And it may be serving your communities and your stakeholders to understand, how do they best want information. And it may not be, a public meeting per se. They may ask for something else. And so, understanding too, like, what does the even access to a webinar look like if you have community members with no high-speed broadband access, and or maybe a cell phone where they're paying for just a bucket of minutes per se, right, for the month, and your public meeting is 2 hours long, but that exceeds what they are available to pay per month. And so things to think about. So I think it might require a little bit more surveying for your community members and seeing what can be created to partner with them in information sharing.